The fall from the stars. The sky above Selvaris was filled with bright stars, but for Canera, it was a prison. She stood inside a cold, metallic room, her small hands trembling as the High Council read her fate. "You are weak," the leader said, his voice firm. "Too small, too fragile. You do not belong among warriors." Canera wanted to protest, but she knew it was useless. The people of Selvaris valued strength above everything else. She was different, smaller than the others, not as strong, not as aggressive. The guards grabbed her arms and dragged her toward a sleek, silver escape pod. The metal was cold against her skin. She struggled, but they did not care. "You will leave this planet," one guard said. "If you survive, it is fate. If you die, it is also fate." The pod's door shut with a loud hiss, sealing Canera inside. A screen flashed in front of her. The system had already chosen a random planet for her to land on. Destination: unknown. She felt the ship shake as it launched into space, her home growing smaller and smaller. Her heart pounded. She was alone now, floating in the darkness. A fiery descent. The journey was rough. The pod sped through space, moving too fast. Canera gripped the sides of her seat, her body feeling heavy as the ship entered the atmosphere of an unknown planet. The pod caught fire, flames dancing around it as it streaked across the sky like a falling star. Below, on the planet's surface, humans stared up at the sky. In a small village surrounded by thick jungle, a group of villagers pointed at the sky. "A star is falling," one man shouted. "No, it is not a star," an elder whispered. "It is a sign from the gods." Canera's pod crashed into the earth, shaking the ground with a loud boom. Smoke and dust filled the air. Animals ran, frightened by the impact. The jungle was silent for a moment. Then whispers spread among the villagers. They grabbed torches and cautiously moved toward the crash site. The metal of the pod glowed hot, and steam hissed from its sides. Then the door slowly opened. A goddess or a stranger? Canera stepped out, her body weak from the rough landing. Her skin glowed faintly with the bioenergy field that all Selvarians had. The villagers gasped. "She shines like the moon," a woman whispered. "She is not human," another man said, stepping back. The elder raised his hands. "Do not be afraid. She has come from the heavens." Canera looked around, confused. The air was thick and warm, different from her cold home. The people in front of her were strange to her, tall, covered in fabrics, their eyes filled with wonder and fear. She tried to speak, but they did not understand her language. They murmured to each other, deciding what to do. Finally, the elder stepped forward and bowed deeply. The others followed. Canera did not understand. Why were they bowing? Then she realized their eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with reverence. They thought she was something divine. A new fate begins. The villagers carefully led Canera to their village. They offered her food, water, and shelter. She was cautious, but they treated her with kindness. At night, as she sat by the fire, she looked up at the sky. Her home was out there, somewhere, but she did not feel sadness. She felt something else. For the first time in her life, she was not unwanted. She was not weak. Here, she was something more. But as she looked into the shadows beyond the village, she sensed something watching. Something dangerous. Her new life had just begun, but danger was already near. The goddess of light. Canera sat near the fire, her glowing eyes scanning the people around her. They spoke in whispers, watching her with awe. Some kneeled before her, their hands clasped together as if in prayer. Others kept their distance, their eyes filled with curiosity and fear. She was used to being ignored, cast aside as weak and unworthy. But here, on this strange planet, she was something different. She was worshipped. The villagers had taken her in, offering her food and shelter. Their kindness confused her. On Selvaris, the weak were abandoned. Here, they were protected. But Canera knew this peace would not last. The jungle around them was thick and dark, and though she did not fully understand human speech yet, she could tell they feared something beyond the trees. Something dangerous. The warlord's shadow. Far from the village, in a stone fortress surrounded by soldiers, a man sat on a wooden throne. His name was Lord Mavic, and he ruled with an iron fist. A scout kneeled before him, breathing heavily. "My lord," the villagers, "they have found something. A woman. She fell from the sky." Mavic narrowed his eyes. "A woman. She is not like us. She glows. The people believe she is a goddess." Mavic's lips curled into a smirk. A goddess? No, he did not believe in gods. He believed in power. If the villagers truly thought she was divine, then he could use that belief. "Gather my men," Mavic ordered. "If they have found a goddess, then I will own her." Learning the ways of Earth. Back in the village, Canera tried to understand the people's language. She listened carefully, picking up small words. The children were the most fearless among them, approaching her without hesitation. A little girl named Lena sat beside her, pointing at things and saying their names. "Water," Lena said, showing her a bowl. Canera hesitated before repeating. "Water." Lena clapped, delighted. "Yes, water." The others watched in wonder. The goddess was learning their words. Canera smiled slightly. Maybe she was not a goddess, but if she was going to survive on this planet, she needed to understand its people. She continued learning, slowly picking up more words. But as she adjusted to her new life, something strange happened. A sick child was brought to her, coughing and weak. The villagers begged her to help. Canera hesitated. She was no healer. But when she touched the child's forehead, her bioenergy reacted instinctively. A faint golden glow passed from her fingers into the child's skin. The child's breathing steadied. His fever faded. The villagers gasped, then fell to their knees in prayer. "She truly is a goddess," someone whispered. Canera's heart pounded. She had not meant to perform a miracle. But now, the villagers' belief in her was stronger than ever. The arrival of war. That night, the village was quiet. Too quiet. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then the silence was broken. Horses, shouting, the clang of metal. Canera's eyes snapped open. She stood just as torches appeared on the horizon. Men on horseback stormed into the village, knocking over baskets, pushing villagers aside. The people screamed and ran, but they were no warriors. They had no weapons, no armor. Mavic's soldiers dismounted, grabbing anyone who tried to resist. Then, a deep voice called out, "Bring me the goddess." Canera stepped forward, her heart racing. The man before her was tall and broad, his armor dark as night. His eyes held no fear, only hunger for power. "So the rumors are true," Mavic said, looking her up and down. "You are not human." Canera stayed silent. Mavic stepped closer. "You have power, goddess, power that belongs to me now." He raised his hand, signaling his men. "Take her. Escape or capture." The soldiers moved fast. Canera barely had time to react. A large man grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. She struggled, but his grip was too strong. A spear flew through the air, piercing the soldier's chest. He collapsed, releasing Canera. The villagers had risen to fight. It was chaos. Men shouted, weapons clashed. The villagers, though untrained, fought with everything they had. Canera turned to run, but another soldier tackled her to the ground. She gasped as pain shot through her body. Mavic loomed over her. "You're coming with me, goddess." He raised his sword. A sudden blast of golden light erupted from Canera's hands, sending him flying back. The soldiers froze. Even the villagers stopped fighting. Canera stared at her hands. She had never been able to use her energy like that before. Mavic got up, eyes burning with fury. "Interesting." He wiped the blood from his lip. "You are even more valuable than I thought." The soldiers regrouped. More were coming. Canera had no choice. She turned and ran into the jungle, her heart pounding. The villagers cried out for her, but she could not protect them. Not yet. The jungle swallowed her, darkness closing in. Behind her, Mavik's voice echoed in the night. "Run, little goddess. I will find you." The rising threat. The jungle was thick, its towering trees stretching toward the night sky like silent guardians. Canera ran, her breath ragged, her heart pounding like a war drum. Twigs snapped beneath her bare feet as she pushed through dense foliage. She could still hear the distant cries of the villagers, the clash of metal, and the deep, commanding voice of Lord Mavik. "Run, little goddess. I will find you." She gritted her teeth. She was no goddess, but to these humans, she was something otherworldly. And now, she was a prize to be hunted. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant fires. She knew the village was burning. Her people, no, not her people, she reminded herself, were being punished because of her. I should go back. I should fight. But what could she do? Her body was small and fragile compared to the towering soldiers of Selvaris. She had never been a warrior. Yet something inside her had awakened back there. The burst of energy that had sent Mavik flying. That had never happened before. Was it the atmosphere of this planet? Something in its air, its energy. She did not have time for answers. Ahead, the jungle split into two paths, one leading toward a steep rocky incline, the other toward a swamp covered in mist. Both were dangerous. Behind her, the howl of hunting dogs echoed in the distance. They were coming. The chase begins. She took the rocky path. It was harder to traverse, but it would slow her pursuers. Her fingers dug into the jagged stone as she climbed, pulling herself up. She reached the top and crouched low, her glowing eyes scanning the area below. Mavik's men were already at the base of the hill. Their torches flickered in the darkness. One of them pointed upward. She went this way. Canera cursed under her breath. She had underestimated their tracking skills. She moved quickly, running along the uneven terrain, her feet skimming across the loose stones. The further she got from the village, the more she realized she had nowhere to go. I cannot run forever. She needed to hide, or fight. A cave entrance loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness. She hesitated for only a second before slipping inside. The Cave of Echoes. The air was damp and cold. Strange vines hung from the ceiling, and the ground was slick with moss. She moved deeper into the cave, her glowing skin casting faint light against the stone walls. She stopped when she heard something. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A voice. It was deep, ragged, and alien. Canera's heart nearly stopped. She was not alone. She turned a corner and saw a figure shackled to the wall. His body was thin, covered in scars. His skin had the faintest glow, just like hers. A Xelvarian. Her breath caught in her throat, one of her own. His head lifted weakly. His eyes, once bright like hers, were now dull with exhaustion. You are not real," he rasped. Another vision, another dream. Canera took a shaky step forward. "You are like me," she whispered. "How are you here?" The man coughed, his chains rattling. "I was taken. Many years ago." He exhaled sharply. "You are their goddess." She flinched. "No." The man laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Then why do they kneel before you?" She had no answer. Mavik closes in. Outside, the sound of boots crunching against stone made her blood run cold. Mavik's voice echoed through the cave. "You can hide, little goddess, but I will always find you." Canera turned back to the Xelvarian. She had no time. "I will free you," she said quickly. The man let out a weak chuckle. "Then hurry." She placed her hands on the shackles. They were ancient, made of iron, rusted with age. She focused, willing her energy to flow through her fingers. The metal glowed hot. then melted away. The man slumped forward, barely able to stand. Canera grabbed his arm, steadying him. "We need to move." But it was too late. A silhouette filled the cave entrance. Mavic. His soldiers flanked him, their weapons drawn. Mavic's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "You truly are something special." Canera stepped in front of the injured Selvarian, her body tense. Mavic's gaze flickered toward the freed prisoner. "I know him. He was a warrior once. Now, he is nothing." He took a slow step forward. "But you could be so much more." Canera clenched her fists. The energy inside her crackled, eager to be unleashed. Mavic tilted his head. "Join me, goddess. Roll beside me, and you will never have to run again." She stared at him, her heart pounding. She could surrender, or she could fight. The first strike. Canera lifted her hands. Golden energy surged from her palms, lighting up the entire cave. The soldiers staggered back, shielding their eyes. Mavic stood firm. "So, you choose war?" Canera didn't reply. She attacked. A blast of energy shot forward, slamming into Mavic. He grunted, skidding back but remaining standing. His armor cracked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I knew you were powerful." He wiped the blood from his lip. "But power alone will not save you." The soldiers rushed forward. Canera spun, dodging a sword aimed for her side. She countered with another blast, sending the attacker crashing into the wall. The freed Selvarian, though weak, fought beside her. He grabbed a fallen soldier's weapon, slashing through another. The cave shook from the force of their battle. Rocks crumbled from above. Mavic raised his sword. "Enough." He lunged. Canera dodged just in time, the blade slicing through the air beside her face. She grabbed the Selvarian's arm. "We need to go." He didn't argue. Together, they ran deeper into the cave, their path unknown. Behind them, Mavic's voice rang through the darkness. "You cannot run forever, goddess." Canera knew he was right. But she wasn't running. She was preparing for war. The prisoner's power. The cave walls trembled as Canera and the wounded Selvarian ran deeper into the darkness. Behind them, Mavic's soldiers struggled to follow, their torches flickering wildly in the damp air. Rocks crumbled from the ceiling, forcing the men to slow their pursuit. Canera's breath came in ragged gasps. Her energy was fading fast, and the weight of the injured warrior beside her made every step harder. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. The man, still weak from years of imprisonment, gritted his teeth. "There is an old tunnel ahead. It leads outside." Canera didn't question him. She had no choice but to trust this stranger. The light from the soldiers' torches grew dimmer behind them. The cave twisted, turning into a narrow passage barely wide enough for them to slip through. "We have to go faster," she urged. But the man stumbled, his legs shaking. His body was too frail, his strength nearly gone. Canera clenched her jaw. She would not let him die here. She grabbed his arm and placed her glowing hand on his chest. Her energy pulsed into him, sending warmth through his body. His eyes widened in shock as color returned to his pale skin. "How?" he whispered. "No time," she said. "Move." Together, they pushed forward, the walls tightening around them. And then, finally, moonlight, a brief respite. They stumbled out of the cave, greeted by the cool night air. The jungle stretched before them, vast and dark, but alive. Canera turned back to the cave entrance. She could hear the distant voices of soldiers. They had lost time, but not enough. "We have to keep going," she said. The man nodded, his strength returning. He was still weak, but he was no longer dying. They moved quickly through the jungle, stepping over twisted roots and thick vines. The sounds of the night surrounded them, chirping insects, rustling leaves, the occasional distant howl of a predator. After what felt like hours, they reached a hidden stream deep within the jungle. The water sparkled under the moonlight. Canera dropped to her knees, cupping water in her hands and drinking deeply. The cool liquid soothed her parched throat. The man sat beside her, watching her closely. "You are different," he said. Canera wiped her mouth and turned to him. "I am Selverian, like you." He shook his head. "No, you are more." He hesitated before adding, "You are evolving." Canera frowned. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his wrists where the shackles had been. "I was strong once, a warrior, like all our kind. But after I was captured, I grew weak." His gaze met hers. "You were born weak. But here, on this planet, you are becoming something else." Canera shivered. She had felt it too. The burst of power back in the village. The energy she had used to heal them. Those abilities had never been hers before. Something about Earth was changing her. But before she could ask more, a distant horn sounded through the jungle. The man's face darkened. "They are tracking us." Canera stood. "Then we can't stay here." But the man remained seated, his expression unreadable. "I am too weak to fight," he admitted. "But you must learn to use what is happening to you." She stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I can teach you." He gestured around them. "This jungle will hide us, but not forever. If you want to survive, you need to learn how to use your power." Canera hesitated. She had spent her entire life believing she was weak. But now, for the first time, she had a chance to be strong. And if she was going to protect the people who had saved her, she had to be ready. Training begins. The next morning, the man, who finally told her his name was Valen, began her training. "You must stop fighting your power," he told her. "You fear it. That is why you do not control it." Canera exhaled slowly, standing in the center of a clearing. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. She let her energy rise, not forcing it, but calling to it. At first, nothing happened. Then, a spark. A faint golden light flickered around her fingertips. "Good," Valen said. "Now focus. Do not let it consume you." She nodded. The last time she had used her power in battle, it had been instinctive, wild. Now she had to control it. She focused harder, and the light grew. It traveled up her arms, swirling around her like a golden mist. Valen nodded in approval. "Now, release it." Canera opened her eyes and pushed her hands forward. A blast of golden energy shot out, hitting a nearby tree and splitting it in half. She gasped, stumbling back. Valen smirked. "You are stronger than you know." Canera looked at her hands, her mind racing. She was changing. And soon, Mavic would see just how much. Mavic's plans. Meanwhile, back in the fortress, Lord Mavic stood before a massive iron cage. Inside, the villagers huddled together, their eyes filled with fear. One of his men approached. "We lost her trail, my lord." Mavic didn't look away from the cage. "She will come back," he said calmly. The soldier hesitated. "And if she doesn't?" Mavic smiled darkly. "Then we will give her a reason." He turned to the prisoners, his eyes cold. "Send word to the village. If their goddess does not surrender." He unsheathed his sword and ran a finger along the blade. "We start executing them, one by one." The turning point. Deep in the jungle, Canera's training continued. She learned to control her energy, to fight with it instead of fearing it. Valen watched with quiet pride. "You are ready," he said one night. But before she could reply, the sound of distant screams filled the air. Canera froze. She knew that sound. The village. She turned to Valen, her hands clenched into fists. "I have to go back." Valen nodded. "Then let's make sure you're not going back alone." He grabbed a weapon, a spear taken from one of Mavic's fallen soldiers. Together, they stepped out of the jungle, ready for war. Mavic wanted a goddess. Now he was about to face one. The goddess rebels. The night was thick with the scent of burning wood and fear. The village that had once welcomed Canera was now a battlefield. Smoke rose into the sky, turning the stars into faint ghosts above. Canera stood at the edge of the jungle, her heart pounding. The screams of the villagers echoed in her ears. Mavic had attacked. He was forcing her to return. Beside her, Valen gripped his spear, his expression unreadable. He had once been a warrior, a captive left to rot. But now he was her ally. "Are you ready?" he asked. Canera looked at her hands, where golden energy crackled beneath her skin. She had trained for days, pushing her limits, learning to control her power. But was she ready? She had no choice. "I am," she said. Without another word, they ran toward the village. The fires of war. The scene before her was worse than she had imagined. Mavic's men were everywhere, their torches setting huts ablaze. The villagers were on their knees in the center of the square, their hands tied, their faces streaked with tears and soot. And there, Mavic stood at the front, his dark armor gleaming in the firelight. A prisoner was forced forward, a young boy. Canera's blood went cold. Mavic raised his sword. "You have had enough time to surrender, goddess." He glanced around as if searching for her. "If you do not come forward, this child dies." The boy's mother screamed, struggling against the ropes that bound her. Canera stepped out of the shadows. The moment she appeared, gasps filled the air. The villagers looked at her with wide eyes, hope returning to their faces. Mavic smiled. "Ah, there you are." Canera's golden energy pulsed around her, flickering like fire. "You think you can threaten these people, and I will bow to you," she said, her voice steady. Mavic tilted his head. "I think you are outnumbered. Look around." His soldiers surrounded her, dozens of them, armed and armored. Swords gleamed under the firelight. Arrows were already aimed at her chest. "I do not need an army," Canera said softly. Mavic smirked. "Then you will die alone." But he was wrong. Because at that moment, Valen emerged from the shadows behind her, and he was not alone. The villagers who had once been too afraid to fight had taken up weapons. Pitchforks, knives, makeshift spears. They were done kneeling. The battle begins. Mavic's smirk faded. Canera lifted her hands, and the air crackled with golden power. Then, chaos exploded. She struck first. A wave of energy burst from her palms, knocking a row of soldiers backward. Valen leaped into the fray, his spear a blur as he cut through the enemy ranks. The villagers, emboldened by Canera's presence, charged into battle. For the first time, Mavic's forces were on the defensive. Canera fought like she never had before. She moved faster than she thought possible, her body lighter, stronger. She dodged a sword swing and countered with a pulse of energy that sent her attacker flying. Another soldier lunged. She caught his wrist mid-strike and twisted. The sword clattered to the ground. She was not weak anymore. She was a force of nature. Mavic growled in frustration. He had not expected a real fight. He stormed toward her, his sword raised high. "I will put you in chains," he snarled. Canera stood her ground. "Try." Their weapons clashed, golden energy meeting cold steel. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield. For the first time, Mavic's eyes showed something he had never felt before. Doubt. Turning the tide. The battle raged on. Canera fought not just for herself, but for the people who had believed in her when she was nothing. The villagers, once powerless, were winning. Soldiers began to retreat, some throwing down their weapons, refusing to fight anymore. Mavic roared in frustration. "Cowards, stand and fight." But his army was broken. He was losing. Canera saw the truth in his eyes. He had spent his life conquering others. But now, faced with someone who could not be conquered, he was afraid. "You will not rule these people," she said. "Not anymore." Mavic lunged one last time, but Canera was faster. She sidestepped his attack and struck his chest with both hands. A massive burst of golden energy exploded from her palms, sending him flying across the battlefield. He crashed into the burning remains of a hut, his armor cracked and broken. He did not rise. The remaining soldiers dropped their weapons. Some ran, others surrendered. The battle was over. The village had won. The birth of a legend. The morning sun rose over the battlefield, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The villagers gathered around Canera, bowing deeply. "You saved us," the elder said. "We were right to believe in you." Canera looked at her hands, still glowing faintly with power. She had not just survived, she had become something more. She turned to Valen. "It's over." But he shook his head. "No, it is just beginning." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Valen looked toward the sky. "The Selvarians who cast you out, they will come for you." Canera's heart skipped a beat. She had spent so much time fighting on Earth, she had forgotten about her own kind. They had abandoned her. But now, they might see her as a threat. She took a deep breath. Let them come. She was not weak anymore. She was ready. The battle of faith. The morning after the battle, the village still smelled of smoke and blood. The bodies of Mavic's soldiers lay scattered, some taken by the jungle, others left where they fell. The villagers, though weary, stood victorious. Canera gazed at the rising sun, her body aching, but her mind sharp. She had won. But victory was only the beginning. Valen approached, his spear resting against his shoulder. His wounds were healing quickly, thanks to Canera's energy, but his eyes carried the weight of something deeper. "They will come," he said. Canera turned to him. "Mavic's men." Valen shook his head. "No, your people." The words settled heavy in her chest. The Selvarians had cast her out, sent her away as a failure, but they had not expected her to survive, let alone thrive. And now she had power, followers, and a place where she belonged. The stars would not ignore that. Canera exhaled, her golden energy flickering at her fingertips. "If they come," she said, "I will face them." But she didn't yet know how soon that moment would arrive. The sky burns. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. The village worked to rebuild, and Canera trained, growing stronger, learning more control. She was no longer afraid of her power. She embraced it. But on the 4th night, the sky changed. A bright blue star appeared, unmoving, directly above the village. Valen saw it first. He stepped out of his hut, eyes widening. "No," he whispered. Canera followed his gaze. Her heart clenched. It was not a star. It was a ship, and it was descending. The villagers saw it next. Fear rippled through them. Whispers filled the air. More gods. Is it a sign? Canera's fists clenched. No, it was not a sign. It was a warning. Her people had come. The arrival of the Selvarian lords. The ship hovered over the jungle, its silver hull gleaming under the moonlight. It was smaller than the warships of Selvaris, but its presence was enough to send a shiver down Canera's spine. A low hum vibrated through the air as the ship slowly landed in a clearing beyond the village. Canera and Valen moved forward cautiously, the villagers trailing behind, watching in awe. Steam hissed from the ship's underbelly. A ramp descended, and from the shadows they emerged. 3 figures walked down the ramp, their tall, armored bodies glowing with the same golden energy Canera had begun to master. Selvarians. Their leader was taller than the others, his presence commanding. His piercing silver eyes locked onto Canera immediately. His name was High Lord Vekros, a commander of the Selvarian elite, the same council that had banished her. Canera stood her ground as he approached. "You are alive," Vekros said, his voice smooth but sharp. "I am," she replied, "and I am not leaving." Vekros studied her, his expression unreadable. "Your exile was meant to be your end. Instead, you have become something unexpected." He glanced at the villagers behind her. These creatures worship you." Canera narrowed her eyes. "I did not ask them to." Vecros smirked. "And yet they do." He circled her slowly. "We have been watching. We have seen what you have become. You were cast out for your weakness, yet now you wield a power that even the strongest of our kind struggle to master." He stopped in front of her, his gaze dark. "The High Council sees you as a threat." The villagers tensed. Some reached for weapons, but Canera lifted a hand. This was her fight. She met Vecros's gaze. "If I am a threat, it is because you made me one." The air crackled with tension. Vecros smiled coldly. "You misunderstand, Canera." He took a slow step back. "We are not here to kill you." He raised a hand. Energy pulsed through his fingers, golden and fierce. "We are here to bring you back. A choice of power." Canera's mind raced. They wanted to take her back. She had spent her life being rejected by her own people. Now, when she had finally found a home, they returned, not to destroy her, but to claim her. She did not trust them. But she needed answers. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why now?" Vecros's smirk didn't fade. "Because you have become something greater." He gestured around her. "These people believe in you. That kind of devotion. It is power." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The High Council fears you, but I do not." He tilted his head. "Join us, Canera. Return to Selveris. Stand at my side, and we will rule together." The villagers stiffened. Their goddess, their protector, was being asked to leave. Canera stared at Vecros, reading the truth behind his words. He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to use her. She exhaled slowly. And then she did something Vecros did not expect. She laughed. Low and soft at first, then louder, until it filled the air. "You think I would leave this place?" She took a step forward, her energy flaring. "You think I would turn my back on the people who gave me a home?" Vecros's smirk vanished. Canera lifted her hands, golden flames blazing around her fingers. "No," she said, "I will not return." Her eyes burned as she met his gaze. "I will not be your pawn." Vecros's jaw clenched. The other Xelvarians behind him tensed, their hands drifting toward their weapons. The moment hung heavy in the air. Then Vecros sighed. "A shame," he said. And then he attacked. The clash of titans. Vecros moved faster than any human Canera had ever faced. One moment he stood still, the next he was lunging, his hands glowing with raw energy. Canera blocked the strike, the impact sending shockwaves through the air. The ground beneath them cracked. The villagers screamed, scrambling for cover. Valen raised his spear, ready to fight. But Canera shouted, "Stay back." This was her fight. Vecros struck again. Canera dodged, then countered with a blast of energy. He deflected it with ease. "You are powerful," he admitted, "but you are still learning." Canera's breath was heavy. He was strong, stronger than Mavic. But she had something he didn't. She had a reason to fight. She clenched her fists, drawing upon every ounce of power within her. The ground trembled. Her golden energy exploded outward, knocking Vecros back. He hit the ground, stunned. Canera walked toward him, her voice steady. "Leave," she said, "and tell the High Council this." She raised her hands, energy swirling like a storm. "I am no longer one of you." Vecros stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "This is not over," he said. He turned. The other Xelvarians followed. Moments later, the ship ascended into the sky. Canera watched them go, her heart steady. She had won again. But war was coming. And next time, she would be ready. The legend lives on. The Xelvarian ship vanished into the sky, leaving behind nothing but silence. The villagers, who had been holding their breath, erupted into cheers. Canera stood in the clearing, her chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. The golden energy that had surged through her moments ago now flickered softly around her hands before fading. She had faced the strongest of her kind, and had won. But victory did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something much, much larger. Valen stepped beside her, watching the sky. His expression was unreadable. "They will come back," he murmured. Canera knew he was right. And next time, they wouldn't come with words. They would come with warships. With an army. She turned to the villagers who were still celebrating, their voices filled with relief and admiration. They had been ready to fight for her, to die for her. She had to be ready to do the same for them. She was not a goddess. She was something greater. She was their protector. A new path forward. Over the next few days, the village became a place of renewal and transformation. The people had seen what they were capable of when they stood together. No longer did they see themselves as weak farmers and simple people. They had fought and won. Valen, once a broken prisoner, now stood tall once more. He trained the strongest villagers, turning them into warriors. Not conquerors, not oppressors, but defenders. Canera worked beside them, pushing her power further. Every day, she grew stronger. She moved faster. She hit harder. She was becoming something that Selvarians had never anticipated. An opponent worth fearing. She was no longer the outcast of her homeworld. She was Canera of Earth. The Selvarian Council decides. Far beyond Earth, in the vast halls of Selvaris Prime, the High Council gathered in shadows. Their faces were hidden beneath dark metallic masks, their voices nothing but echoes in the grand chamber. At the center of the room, Vekros knelt. He had returned alone, leaving Canera behind. "She has refused our offer," he said, his voice carefully measured. The eldest of the council, a woman known as High Matriarch Lysara, leaned forward. "Then she is no longer one of us." "No," Vekros said. He hesitated. Then he smirked. "She is something else entirely." The council members whispered among themselves. "She is dangerous. She is untrained. She is an anomaly." Vekros shook his head. "She is stronger than you realize. She is adapting to Earth's environment, and she has already begun to master her abilities." Lysara's fingers tapped against the arm of her throne. "Then she must be eliminated before she becomes a true threat." Vekros exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "I disagree." The council froze. No one defied the High Matriarch so openly. She narrowed her eyes. "Explain yourself." Vekros smirked. "Canera is the first of her kind. A Selvarian who has evolved beyond our expectations. Instead of killing her," he leaned forward, his voice like silk, "we should be studying her." Silence. Then Lysara nodded slowly. "Send the fleet." Vekros's smirk widened. The decision had been made. Earth would be tested. And Canera. She would either rise or fall. The storm approaches. Back on Earth, Canera woke in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. Something was coming. She could feel it. She stepped out of her hut and gazed at the sky. The stars were peaceful now, but she knew it was only an illusion. Valen joined her a moment later, standing silently beside her. "You feel it, don't you?" Canera nodded. "They won't leave us alone." "No," he agreed. "They won't." She took a slow breath, her golden energy flickering to life around her fingers. "They think I am an anomaly," she murmured. Valen smiled faintly. "You are." She smirked. "Then let's show them what an anomaly can do." The war to come. The villagers had begun their training. The jungle had become their stronghold. And Canera. She was preparing for the battle of her life. Far above, beyond the limits of human sight, that Selvarian fleet had already left their homeworld. They were coming. Canera's people had once abandoned her. Now, they were returning. Not as her allies, but as her enemy. She had one chance to stand her ground. And if they thought Earth was defenseless, they would soon learn how wrong they were. Canera closed her eyes, feeling the energy within her pulse like a second heartbeat. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She was ready.